Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Amy Antonucci, and I'm really glad to welcome you to our New Hampshire Peace Action Peace and Justice Conversation Series online for January 29th, 2024. For over 40 years, New Hampshire Peace Action has been educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all. In the spirit of respect, we would like to start with an acknowledgement that we are doing our work on the traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land, the water, and the people who have been in relationship throughout the generations. And we thank Indigenous New Hampshire for that land acknowledgement. Quick reminder on our Zoom guidelines. We love it when you have your video on. Your audio will be muted. Actually, you're not going to be able to unmute without us giving you permission. So that makes it easy to not make a mistake with that. Remember, the chat is there and you can start putting in questions anytime. We'll move to that a little later as per usual, but you are welcome to use it whenever the question comes to you. So about tonight's program. First, let me tell you why we invited Rivera. So it's not uncommon to hear, even in peace and justice circles, comments like, well, I know war is horrible, but I'm still not really sure what else we should do. Which really got me thinking about the importance of not just opposing war, but also developing a vision and an understanding of alternatives. Both uncovering the history of nonviolence and peacemaking, and also, stoking our own imaginations to come up with even more possibilities. It just seems to be critical if we're going to keep advocating for and believing ourselves in the possibility of peace and justice. So to help us in this journey tonight, we are so glad to welcome Rivera Sun, advisory board member for World Beyond War, author, and activist. She's going to bring us stories and examples of how people have been using alternatives, including nonviolent campaigns, creative resistance, peace-building strategies, and mass movements. Together, they reveal to us how a world beyond war is not only possible, but is emerging, and in fact, on some days, may really be perfectly, fully present here with us. So we're going to hear from her, and then we're going to move to Q&A. And please join me in welcoming Rivera. Nice visible welcome.
Thank you so much, Amy, and for that beautiful introduction, and for you and Doreen for hosting not just this call, but the entire series that you've been doing over the past couple of years. These spaces to gather in, to learn, to listen, to share, to ask questions are the bedrock of how movements for change happen, and how stories like what we're going to explore tonight get shared, not just in our country, but in countries around the world, and significantly in every major movement that has overthrown a dictator, stopped an invasion, won white rights and freedoms, protected the earth, has had meetings like this in which stories like this have been shared between one person and the next. So I thank you for having me on tonight and for continuing this beautiful, sacred tradition that humans have been doing as a way of pursuing peace and justice throughout the decades and the years. As you mentioned, I work with an outfit called World Beyond War, and they have the distinction, maybe you know them, of being one of the few groups to say we're not just against this war or that war for this reason or that reason. We're against this whole concept, the entire institution that is war. It's had about a 12,000-year run here on planet Earth. The earliest known archaeological evidence of organized violence is only from 10,000 BC, which isn't that long when you really consider that we've been around as humans for hundreds of thousands, millions of years. And hopefully, if we're fortunate, if we do our work well in these times, it will be a blip on the timeline of human history. This momentary, foolish thing that humans did in this era of our long and hopefully long-lasting existence on this beautiful planet. But in order to make it a blip, we need to know the alternatives that exist. And we are very fortunate in this because we come at a time in human history where the stories of how people have stopped wars, prevented wars, and put together the replacements of wars are actually proliferating and accumulating. And so tonight I'm going to share those stories with you. I'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So if you do have questions, jot them down, and hopefully we can get to them all. All right. So we're going to look at ways that people have used peace building, nonviolent struggle, and a variety of other tactics and strategies to do things like preventing a war or replacing a war, which I view as the ultimate prevention. We'll also look at how people have worked to win the war using nonviolent tactics, and I'll explain why this is significant when we get there. We're going to look at how people carved out space for peace when a war is happening around them, hastening and even pushing for an end or a conclusion of a war, especially when the fighting has become entrenched and it's very obvious that neither side is making much of an advancement. We will also look at how people have dismantled the pieces of the war machine and built long-lasting nonviolent infrastructure for security and defense, meeting the core needs that humans are trying to use war and violence to achieve. There's some underlying things that are really of value that all humans want. The problem is that the way that we're going about achieving those is actually contrary to our goals. So just a little disclaimer for this evening. While I'm going to share close to 30 examples, we certainly don't have all the answers to this. Well, we live at a time when there's a lot of these stories and we can collect them and kind of see a broad arc of how peace work is happening. There's a lot of room for a lot more research. You can look at tonight as an introduction to these ideas and also really notice that there are far more examples than we ordinarily think of. If we ask our average citizen, how possible do you think it is for people, regular people, to stop wars? They probably think it's not very possible. But tonight we're going to share, and I bet you already know, that people are quite powerful when they put their minds to it. Another thing to be aware of is this is true with a lot of social justice struggles, but it's especially true in peace and war, that there are multiple narratives around each struggle. And, so every army in human history would be like, oh, we won the war. Every politician is like, we won the war. Or it stopped because, the wise benevolence of some smart ruler. So the official narratives of what stopped a war may be a little different than what you hear tonight, and that's okay. I just ask you to listen with an open mind. So let's start with replacing war. This is one of the most exciting things to recognize that's going on in our world. People are using nonviolent struggle and nonviolent action, a set of tools with over 300 different methods, to address social injustice and gain political goals without resorting to the war or the armed factions or the coups that have been so often what start a major war from breaking out. People are doing this on a scale that most of us, even those of us who are in the movements, don't recognize. I edit nonviolence news, and every week I collect 30 to 50 stories of nonviolence in action from around the world. Frankly, every single one of these campaigns is waged by people who made a choice to use a tool like a boycott, a strike, a protest, a march, instead of picking up guns and trying to achieve their goals at the point of a barrel. You know, we see lots of success stories happening from small things to large things. We cover all kinds of issues. And when you recognize that every single one of these struggles could have been an armed insurrection or a war, it's profound to realize that human beings are choosing over and over again to use nonviolent tactics to achieve those goals. But let's look at a couple really dramatic case studies of times when nonviolent action has replaced what would have otherwise been a war. In 2019 in Bolivia, the right wing contested an election and ran the winner of that election, Evo Morales, out of the country, replacing him with the right wing candidate, who then quickly cracked down on indigenous people and passed a bunch of horrible laws. The people shut down the country. They put up roadblock after roadblock. They protested and marched in the streets with the demand that they hold new, fresh elections because the right-wing woman who was the president at the time was not officially the president. This persisted for a year and a half, and then they achieved the goal of getting new elections to be held, in which case they elected a left-leaning president. Now, the story keeps going because, you know, the right-wing officials then tried to shut down the left-wing government by going on strike. So what you're seeing in this picture is actually dueling nonviolent movements where there's a strike going on the right wing. And on the left wing, they're holding a day of mass action in support of the left-wing government, filling the streets with visible signs of support for that government. This is a great example of something that could easily have become a civil war, but because the people chose to use nonviolent action, it did not. Another great dramatic example happened in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in 1989. When they seceded, they left the Soviet Union using nonviolent struggle, even to the point of staring down tanks that were coming to reinvade and conquer them. So these stories are powerful. And just to illustrate that distinction, in 2021, the Zapatistas of Mexico decided they would invade, quote unquote, Spain in protest of colonialism. They literally sailed the ship up to this beach and planted a flag in the soil of Spain and said in a mock piece of street theater, "We now claim Spain for the Zapatistas." Now, if they had done that with guns on their back, the Spanish government would have shot them in response. If they had tried to have an armed invasion of this country, there would have been a war that broke out. But because they decided to use nonviolent action, and the Zapatistas have not always embraced nonviolent action, but in this case they have, it became an incredible act of political theater that went on tour throughout the country and opened up profound conversations about colonialism. When it comes to Indigenous people, they are at the forefront of waging struggles that could have been wars with nonviolent action, preventing those wars from happening in the violent sense of that. We're seeing this all over the world in Indigenous struggles, and they are quite successful at waging these struggles. So I'm going to continue on and talk about preventing war and how we've used this kind of nonviolent action to stop wars. This is so important because this happens all the time. A new war comes up, we've got to stop it. In Algeria, now you probably remember Algeria had a bloody and horrible war of independence, which they ultimately won. 7 years of just so much death and destruction. The most remarkable part of the story to me happened right after the War of Independence, when the two ruling factions of Algeria couldn't agree on anything, and they dissolved their governmental body, basically their parliament, and said that they were going to go to war with one another. Now, the people said no. Thousands of them went into the street. 20,000 of them marched in the city. They went to the places where the troops were and they stood in front of the tanks. They laid down in front of the soldiers. They blockaded the attempts of these two factions in fighting each other, and they halted in a 6-week period the threat of a civil war. And they brought the two political parties back to the negotiating table together. This is an incredible example of people power stopping war that almost nobody knows about. Another example, a very interesting one, happened just a few months ago in Niger. Niger had a military coup. A military dictator came to power with guns and weapons, taking over the government, ousting the Western powers' favorable sitting president. Now, France had 1,500 troops in the country at the time and threatened to use them to get rid of this military coup. But the people actually didn't want France to get involved. They were tired of being a colonial power. So they took to the streets in large numbers and they said, no, you cannot use your military might to interfere with our sovereignty. Whether you like the dictator or you don't like the dictator, whether you're for the military coup or you don't like the military coup, that is irrelevant. What we don't want is you meddling. This went to even international because France tried to call upon ECOWAS, which is kind of like this part of Africa's NATO, and tried to get Nigeria to send troops in. And the Nigerian government was favorable at first. But the Niger people called on the Nigerians and said, please tell your government not to invade. So the Nigerian people went into the streets and pressured their president to withdraw his statement of support. This meant that there weren't more and more troops pouring into Niger, so the people power movement could go to the military bases and surround them with this kind of protest that you see right here, fairly peaceable, until France actually removed its troops from Niger and let Niger decide its own destiny. How that will play out, we don't know. But significantly, this was a moment where people stopped a war from breaking out. Another example happened in 1905 when Sweden and Norway, which were basically one country at the time, I think because Sweden had invaded and conquered Norway, they were getting ready for dissolution, to split into two countries. Now, Sweden had threatened that if Norway seceded, they would invade and reconquer them. So the labor movements of both countries said, no, absolutely not. We are going to rally and mobilize all the workers of Norway and Sweden, all the soldiers of Norway and Sweden to go on general strike if you invade. And indeed, when Norway seceded, the threat of this strike was powerful enough to stop the politicians from launching a war of reconquest. This photo is from the 1909 general strike. Couldn't actually find one from 1905, but that would be great to find. The stories actually go on and on. We're not going to have enough time to talk about all of them in detail tonight. But some of you may remember the Pledge of Resistance to the U.S. escalation of the war in El Salvador and then also in Nicaragua. This is in the 1984 or 1990s. And, you know, I was just a small toddling child in those days, so I don't remember this one directly. But my colleagues who were involved in this, in fact, one of them is standing on the stage right there at the microphone, say that, you know, tens of thousands of people were part of this campaign, that, you know, thousands of people blockaded arms shipments for 2 years at this particular base in the US, that 40, I think it was, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but a great many veterans did a 40-day hunger strike against the escalation of this war. And indeed, they did stop the US from escalating the armed conflict that was ongoing. Another story I'd like to tell in this department happened during the People Power Revolution in the Philippines. Now, the general context of this is that the people were trying to oust their dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, who was trying to steal an election. And indeed, they did achieve this. But there was this really critical moment that happened on the ground when millions of people were in the streets, and Ferdinand Marcos ordered the soldiers, well, there was a faction of soldiers who seized a base, basically. And Ferdinand Marcos ordered the army to go retake the base. So, here they are. The army's coming down to go, shoot its way into retaking over this place. And the nuns and the other people of the Philippines went into the street, got down on their knees and said, in the name of God, stop in your tracks. Do not start this bloodbath. And they halted those tanks in place and stopped that tense situation from turning into an ongoing civil war. Because of this, because it didn't just turn into a gunfight in the city of Manila, it meant that the people power revolution could continue to pressure and push, so that Ferdinand Marcos was forced to leave power, and the elected president, Corazon Aquino, was enabled to step into the position of president. Lest we think we need 1 million people on our sides, let's remember Stanislav Petrov. Because of this man, we are all sitting here today. In 1983, he received orders to push the button to drop the bomb, that there was a report that US nuclear bombs were incoming, and he was supposed to fire back right away. He said, no, let's check for verification. They threatened to court-martial him, and indeed they stripped him of his rank after this. But he thought it was too important to risk, and it turned out it was a false report. Because of this one man's non-cooperation with orders to launch a war, we are all alive today. I hope none of us are ever in that position, but if we are, I hope we remember the story of Stanislav Petrov and remember where our people power lies. So what do we do when war has already broken out? It's happening all around us. Maybe we're being invaded or occupied, and all of our friends and family think that, picking up guns is the only answer. Well, we can work to win the war using nonviolent struggle and nonviolent tactics. Surprisingly, some great examples of this happened during World War II under Nazi-occupied countries. There are the examples that we really know about, like the Danish rescue of the Jews, where after the Nazis invaded Denmark, the Danish people whisked away 6,000 Jews right under the noses of the Nazis, hiding them virtually overnight, checked into hospitals under false names, put into attics, and then moved out through the north of the country to Sweden to safety. But there are lots of other stories, some that are only now getting attention, like The Dutch Bankers. There's a wonderful Netflix movie called The Resistance Banker. And these Dutch bankers basically used their position as bankers to funnel money to the resistance. Now, not all of that resistance was nonviolent, but significantly, one of the things that they did was they funded a strike of railroad workers who refused to work, particularly to move munitions shipments to the Western Front, where Germany was trying to maintain its occupation of France. Because this didn't happen, it actually helped to turn the tide on the war. So these stories should remind us that we have tools to use. If we feel it's morally wrong, and maybe even strategically wrong, to be trying to pick up guns and fight our way out of a war, but we still agree with the primary underlying cause, particularly when a country has been invaded, we feel we have a right to defend our country. We have options of resistance that can be very powerful, that can deny short-term and long-term goals to our occupiers. And we can wage the struggle in a different way. Now, the examples we have from the Nazi-occupied countries are not terribly small. Some of them are quite large, like the Norwegian resistance, teachers' resistance in defense of education. 30,000 teachers refused to implement in the Nazi curriculum, were rounded up and put on trains and sent to a concentration camp. The people ran along the sides of the railroad tracks and gave them bread and blankets through the slats of the railroad cars to show their support. Because of this, the Nazis were not able to implement their fascist curriculum. They were not able to brainwash the next generation of youth. And indeed, it helped to undermine their hold on Norway. So, when we think about it, we often think because we're peace activists, we have to be opposed to the war effort. And while we can sometimes say that we don't agree with the use of violence, there are also often ways that we can contribute to a cause that we feel is moral and just that do not rely on violence. These tactics are so powerful that, even the US government has codified them into their espionage and sabotage manuals, writing down things like work slowly, which is a nonviolent tactic, so that instead of rushing to obey your occupying army's commands, you just work as slowly as possible. Now, this seems a little silly and ridiculous, but when the Nazis occupied Denmark, they wanted the shipyards to build them warships. The Danish shipyard workers worked so slowly, they would even screw in bolts and then unscrew them when the Nazis weren't looking. This was so effective that by the end of the war, the Danish shipyard workers had not constructed one single ship for the Germans. Just imagine the impact that had on World War II. Imagine that impact expanded throughout all the countries that were in a similar position. When we know our tactics of civil resistance and nonviolent struggle, we can be powerful agents of change, even if we don't believe in violence, even if our population has been disarmed. Another example that is little known happened during the US Civil War. 800,000 enslaved African Americans ran off from the South, non-cooperated with slavery, rejected the whole framework, and made their way to refugee camps in the Union North. 800,000 people is a lot of people. It also happens to be about 20% of the enslaved population at the time. 20% is not an insignificant amount of people, and you can be sure that this had a direct economic and functional impact on the South's ability to function and wage war. To me, this was a way of waging struggle. And for the most part, these actions were largely nonviolent. Not entirely, but largely. Another example to share with you happens at the end of the Algerian War of Independence. Massive amounts of French people poured into the streets in France to call for Algerian independence. So while there's this bloody war going on, you also have the French people supporting with nonviolent action the release of Algeria by France, which certainly had an impact on that struggle. In Ukraine, this town was occupied by the Russians, and the populace was poured into the street, even as air grenades were going off overhead, and used nonviolent action to demand the release of the mayor and the withdrawal of the Russian soldiers. They were successful. Ironically, the one thing they had to concede to the Russians was actually to disarm their populace, which I find ironic because they had just proved that even without the use of weapons, they could still resist the Russian occupation. As Bernard Lafayette once said, the thing he loves about nonviolence is that even when you step out of the shower, you're fully armed. So there are things to think about in the use of this kind of working to win a war, that you're also hastening the end of a war. You're mobilizing people who maybe don't have access to guns or morally don't want to use them or physically are not included in the ability to wage that kind of violent struggle. You can broaden the resistance throughout your whole populace. You can help achieve really critical goals of protection and defense without resorting to violence. And you can deny any occupiers or invaders their objectives. This, again, is a very understudied aspect of civil resistance that we would be well worth investing in as peace activists. It's often overshadowed in the narrative of war struggles. And I would love to see some more research into what is the cumulative impact of these types of resistance? Are they actually opening the window in which a war is even won? So let's look at the other side of this. So, in the event that a war is happening, people have carved out space for peace, and we have new research that has shown that these acts of making local ceasefires, using peace team protection, providing peace zones, actually have a direct impact on opening the political imagination and the even the belief that peace can occur. This is really critical. When people stand up for peace, it is often something that heralds the end of a war. It shows that the people are not in favor of continuing this and that the support is dwindling. Even in an entrenched situation like in Afghanistan, when the Hemlin Peace March organized, it showed just how broadly tens of thousands of people opposed the violence that was ongoing, that they didn't want this continuing factional dispute to continue violently. Other tactics are also things like the work that peace teams do, whether it's Peace Brigades International, community peace teams, nonviolent peace force, in creating zones of protection, empowering civilian peacekeepers, de-escalating the threat of violence. Peace teams have a long history and an even more exciting potential. These are groups of people in small and large groups who are trained pragmatically to de-escalate conflicts, provide protective accompaniment, and they can provide realistic alternatives to armed defense of a community. The idea comes from the work of M.K. Gandhi and this man on the left, Badshah Khan, who trained and mobilized a nonviolent army of 80,000 people to help wage struggle against British occupation of India. This was then continued by Gandhi and his successors in the Shanti Sena network and gave rise to those many groups that I just mentioned. If you don't know about this work, I highly recommend getting on the email list for Nonviolent Peace Force and learning everything you can about it. So zones of peace can also include things like the Colombia peace villages and that declared their village to be a militia-free zone, a gun-free zone, and stood up for this even when the armed militia groups came and did massacres of these people who just wanted peace. By creating these zones of peace, you give a space for people who have been embroiled in war to say, this idea that only violence can stop violence is bogus. It's illogical, ultimately. And that if we want an end to violence, we need to actually commit ourselves to waging peace. Those local ceasefires that I mentioned can also include things like this story from Yemen, where in the midst of the broader war, there was a particular water supply line that had been destroyed. This meant that two parts of the city were converging around this one well, and territorial disputes were happening, both around the well and the water access, but also between different groups and factions of armed people on different sides of the conflict, to the point where children were getting killed at this well. It was known as an intractable, unresolvable conflict until a group of young women who had just returned from university came back to their areas of this community and worked with the other women to push the men in the community to actually resolve the dispute, repair the well and the pipeline, and provide water access to the whole city. In order to achieve this, they had to break social taboos and actually march into the meeting of men and insert their voices into the space. This is a great example of how nonviolent struggle can help us open up limited ceasefires or limited zones of peace that can be significantly important, even if we can't stop the entire war. But let's talk about ending war. So over and over again, civil society has actually worked to end, hasten, bring about the stop of wars. This has happened in things like the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, which is roughly around 1000 CE, in which the Haudenosaunee tribes or nations, it's better to say, had been at war in this brutal struggle. And Daganoweda and Hiawatha helped to open up a peace process that significantly brought people together, stopped the war, and people literally buried their hatchets and their weapons underneath the tree that you see depicted here. Another example comes from World War I and the Christmas Day Truce. This is quite well known. What is less well known is that the following year, the higher-ups on both sides were so concerned that this Christmas Day truce would actually lead to the refusal of soldiers to continue to fight the war, that they banned the truce on pain of court-martial and death. This was not necessarily an unfounded fear for the powers that be of World War I. People hated World War I and its huge casualty rate in trench warfare. And in fact, what actually ended World War I was, on the one hand, the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia and withdrew from the war. But on the other hand, the German sailors particularly refused to fight in the war anymore. They were going to be redeployed, and instead of accepting that, they walked out in protest. Now, this wasn't entirely nonviolent. There were incidents of violence, but the majority of the sailors actually, and the critical piece of action, their strike and their walkout, were nonviolent actions that directly led to the end of World War I. Over and over, we see this, people can stop wars. The Troubles in Northern Ireland famously were halted because women organized the community of peace people, and 50,000 people marched in the streets every weekend to say enough, enough, enough of this violence. The women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace stopped the Second Liberian Civil War. Like Algeria, they knew how painful war could be, and the Christian and the Muslim women came together to pressure the dictator Charles Taylor to agree to peace talks with the rebels. Now, they knew that they couldn't just leave them together in a room and expect good things to happen. So when the peace talks were happening, the women went to the place they were being held. And when the men couldn't come to resolution on this, the women sat down in front of the doors and said, "You are not leaving this room until you come out with a peace accord." At the same time, the rebel army was actually invading the capital city of Monrovia, and a huge bloodbath was about to break out. The timing of this could not have been any more tense and critical. So the women sit down in front of this door, and the guards outside threaten to arrest them all. And Lima Gaboe, one of the organizers, gets up and says, "If you try to arrest me, I will take off all my clothes." Which doesn't make sense to us as US citizens. But if you are African, that is one of the worst curses that an older woman can do, is to disrobe publicly in front of you. So the guard backs up and says, "Okay, okay, no, 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 just keep sitting where you are." The women keep sitting, and ultimately the men come out with a peace accord. They call the rebel army in Monrovia. They stopped them from invading. The dictator Charles Taylor steps down and resigns. The war stops. They hold a democratic election, and Ellen Sirleaf Johnson gets elected as the first female leader of Liberia. There's an amazing documentary called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which is well worth watching. All right, so the thing we really want to work on as well is how to make war less likely to break out in the first place. And to do this, we need to use all these tools of nonviolent action to do things like shutting down bombing ranges like they did in Puerto Rico, decoupling universities and our economy from military and militarism, stopping war maneuvers like NATO. NATO war maneuvers have precipitated so many wars, including the invasion of Ukraine. They can be stopped, as these community members in Montenegro proved, but it takes organizing and commitment. We need to ask our youth to refuse to serve in the military. We need to stop the expansion of the military, as the Japanese have been working to do. And this list goes on, and as peace activists, you know the many angles of this, divesting our banks and institutions from all of this. So I'm going to stop there for this evening, but there is a whole theory of civilian-based defense through which, we can make our countries unconquerable using nonviolent action. And there's examples that come from Czechoslovakia and from Lithuania, and we don't have time to go into tonight, but it's also being used on things like defending against fracking or some of the corporate abuses that we see. So, what can we do? Just to recap, it's always important to organize now and not just wait for the next conflict to break out. There are harder and easier times to stop a war. The beginning or the outbreak of a war is often the hardest. We can all study nonviolent struggle and civilian-based defense. We need to understand that a lot of these campaigns are succeeding not because they're protesting in the street, but because they're doing things like strikes and shutdowns and walkouts and refusing to let business or life as usual continue on. We all have roles and leverage points. Sometimes we are like Stanislav Petrov, and we are the one who should not push the button to drop the bomb. Other times we play a different role. But we can always support anti-war voices, and especially among the aggressors, such as among the Russians right now. The anti-war movement needs our support. Among the Israelis who are saying, no, this is not okay. We need to uplift those voices and make sure they are not getting lost. And if you are embroiled in the middle of a war, remember that if you don't want to pick up weapons, there are other tools that you can use if the cause is just. And remember, peace is not a popularity contest. When we're working for peace, almost everybody gets mad at us until we win, and then everybody wants to give us a Nobel Prize, right? So I will stop there because I want time for your questions. As you can see, there's a whole field of this research, and the more we know about it, the more empowered we feel at any point in a conflict to bring out a strategy that might succeed in stopping, halting, preventing a war. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rivera. So beautiful, so moving. I need a moment here. So yeah, let's look for some questions. It's great for you to put them in the chat, at least to start. That said, you can also raise your hand and get called on if you'd like to ask it directly. Use the reaction button, please. So I definitely see you. There's enough folks here. I can't see everyone on the screen. I thought I'd start with a question that came up a while back, and that is, someone would like to know what books to read. So like, Can you give us a reading list? In fact, I'll start it off because I'm in the middle of reading Nonviolence by Mark Kurlansky. I just read the chapter on how the American Revolution really was won nonviolently, which I did not know. So that was our history that we don't get, given to us is fascinating. But Rivera, do you have other things you can share with us?
Oh, so many. I recommend the work of Gene Sharp. There are many books, but you should definitely start with Politics of Nonviolent Action and work your way through it. There's a great book called Recovering Nonviolent History, edited by Maciej Bartowski. There are a number of wonderful firsthand accounts, including the Waging Peace by David Hartsoe, which talks about so many things and movements that he's been a part of. I also recommend the Global Nonviolent Action Database, which is online and digital and has over 1,000 case studies, which all have success ratings on them, so you can read the best things that have won. And I got started on this whole path because I was writing a novel called The Dandelion Insurrection, and I didn't know how to get my characters out of trouble, non-violently speaking. So I literally Googled how to bring down dictators non-violently, and you will be amazed by what comes up. So I could go on. I also recommend World Beyond War has a booklet basically about all of this work and many, many other things that I did not have time to talk about tonight. So please go to worldbeyondwar.org and find their manual basically about how we replace war altogether.
Great, thank you. Here is one from Arnie. Rivera, the United Auto Workers is calling for a general strike on May 1st. Oh wait, May 1st, 2028. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know of efforts of nonviolent educators to offer support and training for that?
I haven't heard about training specifically for that general strike, but we have enough lead time that you could take direct action training with anyone. You could look into labor solidarity actions. If you're part of a union, start talking to your union about it. If your kids are part of a union, start talking to them. I think what they're planning to do with the United Auto Workers has a lot of merit, and we should be preparing ourselves to support it.
Great. And hey, Arnie, maybe you have a link you could put in the chat for where we can learn more. I hadn't even heard about that yet. So Mike's hand is up. Mike, I'm going to give you unmuting privileges there or whatever and see if that works. There you go.
That work. Okay, so my question revolves around long-standing conflicts that haven't gone to war. So, for example, when I watch Ukrainian TV, they say we've been at war since 1917 off and on, and we've had this conflict. We hate with Russians. They're domineering this, that, and the other. And so we want to do whatever we can to get rid of them. And you have similar things with Israel and Gaza. People say, oh, yeah, we've been at war since the British mandate in 1917. And so my question is, sometimes we have these really hot wars that all of a sudden now we think people are at war, but there was actually this war underneath the surface where they weren't firing at each other. A good example of this might be Yugoslavia. People might say, well, Tito kept them from fighting, and then when Tito dies, they all want to kill each other. What happened, right? And so that's part of my question, and something that kind of fits into that is the idea that there's intelligence agencies that stoke wars or stoke conflicts, or they might appear to stoke conflicts. During the Cold War, the CIA versus the KGB versus the Chinese or the British or the French. And so I'm wondering, when you have all these players and you have all these wars that are simmering but haven't gone into war, how do you start to address the conflicts?
Thank you, Mike. That's a very complex answer, question and a complex answer. I would say a couple of things. There's a whole field of peace work that falls under the umbrella of peace building, that we didn't really cover as much tonight, but is well worth knowing about. Um, but there is no substitute for justice, right? Like actually dealing with the core issues, the grievances that are held by people. So repairing relationships, acknowledging the harms of the past, creating a just and livable present for people. If we look at the conflicts that are going on, a lot of them to be resolved at all are going to have to do that hard and thorny work that is not easy to do. And then, if we want to prevent wars from happening, addressing the underlying issues is really, really important and not easy in any of the situations that we can look around the world and see, including here in the US. I would say that kind of on a long, broad arc, always advancing the concept that just because we're picking up weapons doesn't mean we're going to solve our problems. It is a great reminder for people. We tend to forget that, right? That we think just because one side's going to win with bombs or guns or tanks, it doesn't actually mean it's going to equate to justice for either side or healing or transformation. And we can look to examples like the truth and reconciliation work that's been done, notably in South Africa, but also with indigenous communities. The Wabanaki here in Maine, where I live, had an incredible process. Or restorative justice work, for example, as practices that help us to get to those underlying, often historic grievances that people are feeling. So I know that's not the whole answer, but I think that's what I can offer to you tonight.
Thanks, Rivera. Okay, Jean has a big question. Here we go. How do we prevent World War III from breaking out this year? The situation in the Middle East is quite disturbing, wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I agree. Um, as US citizens, I think we have a couple of responsibilities. One is that we need to talk to our fellow citizens, friends, and families about refusing to participate in expanding wars. War is not the answer, that great old slogan. We have a lot of other things that this global community needs to achieve in the next 5 years, especially around climate issues, or we're just not going to have a future as humanity. And a World War III is not going to help us achieve any of those goals. So, asserting that message constantly and consistently is going to be really important. Second, we have these warmongering politicians, and they're our responsibility. They're like our bad behaving relative at the party that we need to take aside and either take them home or, sit them in a corner and distract them with something else. I don't know what the metaphor is here, but our politicians, as hard as they are for us to think about wrangling and getting them on board, they're our responsibility to stop them from escalating war. And we need to be involved in that effort, no matter how frustrating it seems. So beyond that, the third thing that we can do as international citizens is support the anti-war voices in all the various countries who are getting embroiled in this, because they are just as overlooked and ignored as we are. So we need to have international solidarity as an anti-war movement. And I think that's going to be critically important this year.
Okay, thanks. We have a pretty strong campaign in New Hampshire, vigiling outside our representatives' offices, having meetings with them, which is wildly frustrating. I can tell you, that's my experience of it. But yeah, I just keep thinking how much worse it is for people in other places. And I think, well, if the worst thing I am today is frustrated, I'll make the call again.
Yeah, Amy, I just want to say, when you look at that Pledge of Resistance campaign, that's a great story to get to know really well because, Nixon was gung-ho to send weapons, send war, escalate that up. And the reason that he didn't was because of these campaigns. So, the parallels are very obvious. We learned from the Iraq War protests that we can't just protest. It's important. Protesting is really important, but we need to be able to non-cooperate and intervene and blockade those military shipments and get in front of the training facilities where they're trying to train the mercenaries in order to really make the impact that we need.
Thanks. That's a great point. David, are you looking to hold on? Yeah. Is it letting you? Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Rivera. This fantastic presentation. So a question I have is how this presentation that you've done this evening needs to be shown, be shared with people all over the country and all over the world. And any thoughts you have about how that can happen. And then while I have the mic, there's just a couple other resources people are asking for. One is the book that you mentioned from World Beyond War called A Global Security System and Alternative to War. And for people that say, well, what's the alternative to, preparing for global wars? Well, here it is. And that's available on the website, and you can buy it or get it online. A second, Gene Sharp, you mentioned, but has a book called Waging Nonviolent Struggle. And that and this book called A Force More Powerful have chapters from countries all over the world where they've been waging nonviolent struggle. And so I highly recommend those. And there's also a film called A Force More Powerful, which has 6 powerful nonviolent campaigns where people really made major change. And that's 6 different segments. And that's available online at Nonviolent Struggle/films. And these should be shown in every church, every community, every school around the world. And it's also in many different languages. So we need to inspire people about the power of nonviolent struggle, which you've been doing so beautifully. Thank you, Rivera.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for remembering all the titles of the books I couldn't remember when I was asked about it. Yeah, just go to David's reference list. That's my reference list. So a couple things. Please refer this talk and me to your friends and colleagues in other branches of the peace movement. I am very happy to give this talk. It's a newer one for me. It's this kind of comprehensive overview is kind of a newer concept for us to look at as peace activists, I think. And please tell your friends and please get them in touch with me. Okay. I also have a recording of a slightly longer version of this talk that you can share. It's on YouTube. And I think you probably can share this talk as well. And Amy kindly put my website into the chat box. I will also put in the link to Nonviolence News as well.
Great, thank you so much. And I am going to wind things down here. That hour went fast. So thank you so much, Rivera, for your work and for sharing with us tonight. This was a really nice, really heartening, again, and there's a lot of work to be done, and being inspired to do it is really helpful. Again, you can go to riverasun.com and worldbeyondwar.org for more information. Let me also tell you that you can stay in touch with us at New Hampshire Peace Action at nhpeaceaction.org. And on Facebook, here, let me drop some of that in the chat. There we go. To learn more about what we're working on and what programming we have coming up. And here's a quick taste of that. If you're in New Hampshire, please do join us in person for upcoming Ceasefire Now Vigils for Peace, calling for a permanent ceasefire, end to the Israeli blockade of Gaza, and end to U.S. military aid to Israel, and instead embracing a commitment to human rights and peace for all people in the region. This week's schedule is January 31st. That's Wednesday, 2 to 3 at Representative Pappas's office, 660 Central Ave in Dover. And the following day, Thursday, February 1st, noon to 1, City Plaza at 107 North Main Street in Concord. Our next online peace and justice conversation will be Monday, February 12th, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And that is called Being Muslim in America circa 2024 with Robert Ozzie. It's a variation of his really popular program, Ask a Muslim Anything, a program which in recent months has come to include issues on conflict, identity, and oppression between Palestinians and Israelis. Also add to your calendar Monday, February 26th, 7 to 8 on Zoom for a conversation with Jamal Abdi, president of the National Iranian American Council, who will talk about Iran and the Mideast turmoil and how those fit together. This series is free, but we greatly appreciate any financial support you can give us. Again, popping that into the chat. Yeah, and I actually found a nice little closing quote here for us from Coleman McCarthy. Wars aren't stopped by fighting wars any more than you can fight fire with fire. You fight fire with water. You fight violence with nonviolence. Please join me with a real visible thank you to Rivera. Again, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone here for coming, for doing this work, for caring about this issue, for talking about it, and, you know, keeping on here. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.